But there was little time for celebration. Day by day, revelation followed revelation.
It was the single most heavily covered story in the entire history of the Republic. And it was all heavily anti-us. It was a constant pounding and pounding and pounding.
By April 1973, the trail had reached back to the highest levels of the White House. Nixon decided he would have to sacrifice Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He broke the news to them in person at Camp David.
Camp David was the low point of his presidency, and I think the low point of his life, when he had to step up to the fact that the next day he had to call these men in and tell them both that they had to leave.
His eyes were red-rimmed. He was genuinely sobbing, and so was I. It was the end of a long association.
I had never seen him so distraught. He was in his study, just completely lifeless. He turned to me then and he said, "Do you think I should resign?"
And he had had a few drinks, but he just had to kill the pain that he felt in taking that step.
Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know.
Later that evening, Nixon phoned Haldeman. Their conversation was recorded on the White House tapes.
Hope I didn't let you down. No, sir. You got your points over, and now you got it set right and move on. Right where you ought to be. Well, it's a tough thing, Bob, for you, for John, and the rest, but goddammit, I'm never going to discuss this son of a bitching Watergate thing again. Never, 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 never. Don't you agree? Yes, sir. But let me say, you're a strong man, goddammit, and I love you. And I love John, and all the rest, and by God, keep the faith.
And that was another traumatic time for him, for sure. It was loss of a defense, a surrounding fence, so to speak, keeping the dogs out of the yard.
A former Secret Service employee, who has requested anonymity, observed the impact of Watergate on the president.
Nixon wasn't doing well under the stress and pressure, and he became increasingly paranoid. It wore on his face. You could see it. He wasn't what we'd call a classic alcoholic, but when he did drink on the few occasions, he would drink to excess and become rather ugly. And there were 2 or 3 incidents in his career, one of which I was aware of, that he got a bit physical with his wife. Her doctor would reveal that there was damage, facial damage. That's all I can really go into.
We now know that, as Watergate began to overwhelm him, Nixon received a visit from Jack Dreyfus, who gave him a fresh supply of Dilantin, another 1,000 tablets.
And as I was leaving, he said, "You better leave that bottle with me." Some people are more high-strung than others, and he said it helped him with his stress. But I didn't go into details. You know, you don't ask those questions of a president.
In May 1973, with Nixon increasingly isolated and under attack, Dr. Hutschnecker called to express his concern. Nixon's secretary knew she should not log the call. "I won't put it in a memo," she said. In July, the doctor sent a letter to Nixon offering his help.
While on the one hand trying to get in touch with Nixon privately, Hutschnecker did something quite remarkable publicly. He wrote an article published in the New York Times in which, naturally without mentioning Richard Nixon, he wrote a thinly veiled piece stressing his view, which was that before being elected to high office, US leaders should be examined and given a clean bill of psychiatric health as well as a clean bill of physical health.
Now the press were beginning to speculate openly about the president. At an August press conference, a reporter asked Nixon about his capacity to govern.
I was elected to do a job. Watergate is an episode that I deeply deplore, and had I been running the campaign rather than trying to run the country, and particularly the foreign policy of this country this time, it would never have happened. But that's water under the bridge. It's gone now. The point that I make now is that we are proceeding as best we know how to get all those guilty brought to justice in Watergate. But now we must move on from Watergate to the business of the people. And the business of the people is continuing with the initiatives we began in the first administration.
By autumn 1973, the Nixon White House was under siege once again. Protests grew, and Congress began to talk of impeachment, forcing the president from office. At this point, war broke out in the Middle East, and it seemed the Soviets might intervene. But Nixon was absent from the midnight meeting, which put U.S. forces onto heightened alert.
The recommendation was made in his absence, and preliminary steps were probably taken in his absence.
The president was in the residence, and General Haig, who was then chief of staff, would disappear from the Situation Room where we were sitting.
I spoke to the president both before, during, and after that meeting. He was wide awake, sober, and fully in control of his own faculties.
But Kissinger has written in his book, Years of Upheaval, that the president had been agitated and emotional that day. Nixon had retired to bed at 9 p.m.
I felt that it was unusual that he should be absent throughout what was a major point of confrontation between ourselves and the Soviet Union.
The next day, Nixon gave a press conference.
Well, those who saw me during the Middle East crisis thought I bore up rather well. And, Mr. Torres, I have a quality which I guess I must have inherited it from my Midwestern mother and father, which is that the tougher it gets, the cooler I get.
The anecdotals related to me by battle staff team members in proximity to the president at that moment in the White House was apparently that the president was highly inebriated during this period, and there was great concern as to his mental faculties to make these decisions while this nuclear weaponry was being rattled.
By early 1974, calls for the president's impeachment were growing, and Nixon was battling to keep the courts from obtaining the White House tapes, which would prove he was lying about Watergate.
In life generally, and in politics particularly, you don't win them all. I'm an expert on that. And also, you never win even when you win big and just assume, well, now the job is done, because the battle always goes on. That's our system. That's the way it should be. You learn from your defeats, and then you go on to fight again. Never quit. Never quit. Always go on and fight for those things you believe in. Keep your faith, keep your confidence.
He said to me, I'm going to do as much as I can in the time I have left. And he did accomplish some things, particularly in the Middle East. The first president to visit Israel, the first president to visit Syria.
In Egypt, he seemed to court danger in front of huge crowds. Secret Service agents felt he was virtually inviting an assassination attempt. He was also in pain from phlebitis, a potentially life-threatening inflammation of the vein in his left leg.
I was very, very concerned about that because the man was conscious about 18 hours a day and constantly fretting over the situation, and that couldn't but concern anyone about his health, and I was very concerned about that.